Welcome everybody to the Menzies Centre Remembrance Day seminar, and I'm delighted that we have a panel of speakers, a panel of two very distinguished speakers talking to us about Australia's involvement in the First World War from quite different perspectives. Our first speaker, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Carl Bridge, and our second, Dr. Noah Riseman from the Australian Catholic University. I'll introduce them both now, but Carl has a long-standing appointment later this evening, so we're actually going to run the papers as if separately, effectively. So Carl will speak for the first half hour or so, and then we'll have questions to his paper, followed by Noah's, and then I hope you'll join us for a drink in the adjacent room. And before I go any further, I should say my name is Ian Henderson. It's a great pleasure to be the director of the Menzies Centre. However, a yet more esteemed associate and former director of the Menzies Centre is sitting to my right in the form of Professor Carl Bridge, a man that needs little introduction. He's professor. He's still Professor of Australian History at King's College London, and of course was a formative director of the Menzies Centre for many years. His current research falls into four areas: the history of Australian diplomacy and defence, war and society in 20th century Australia, Australian historiography, and the history of the British world, all of which in a sense will come into his take on Australia's involvement in the First World War, Anglo-Australian diplomacy, 1914 to 1919. After Carl, we will have Dr. Noah Riseman, who comes to us from the Australian Catholic University, and he'll be talking about Aboriginal Australians in the First World War. He's a senior lecturer in history in the Melbourne campus of the ACU, currently here in Europe on research leave. His research focuses on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contributions to Australia's defence, as evident from his paper today. This is now part of two ARC, Australian Research Council projects: Defending Australia, Defending Indigenous Rights, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Military Service and Australian Identity 1946 to 2003, and an ARC linkage project running through the Australian National University, Serving Our Country, History of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People in the Defence of Australia. But before we get to Dr. Riseman, it's a great pleasure to hand over to Professor Carl Bridge, speaking about Anglo-Australian diplomacy, 1914 to 1919.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henderson. This, I suppose, is it's a November the 11th event, the day after.
That's right.
Some of you might not know that the 2-minute silence was the suggestion of a Melbourne journalist, a man called Honey, who suggested it to George V. So when you have your 2-minute silence, it should be honey-coloured by a chap from Melbourne. The title Anglo-Australian Diplomacy in the First World War is a sort of misnomer, because formally speaking, we had none. We had no diplomats operating really in the First World War, although we did have a High Commissioner. You could call him a diplomat, though it wasn't until later really that they became diplomats. So it was internally within the empire. In fact, we had no diplomats to anywhere. We had a Department of External Affairs in Canberra, but we had no representatives around the world for them to operate through, apart from this High Commissioner. However, what the Prime Ministers and the Defence Ministers and others did in terms of relations with the UK and other places, these days we would call diplomacy. So the Department of Foreign Affairs has agreed that a team, 5 of us, including me, edit a volume on Anglo-Australian diplomatic relations in the First World War. As I say, even though there weren't any. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when the book comes out on Anzac Day 2016. Some people will say the book's about something that didn't exist. Australia in 1914, very different place from Australia today. Same shape, same part of the world, but very different in lots of other ways. 1/5 of the population of today, so just under 5 million people. Vast majority of them, depending on how you count them, how they define themselves, immigrants from the British Isles or from the rest of Europe. Of course, there's an Indigenous population and there are people from elsewhere, but 90% or so of the population is either of British descent or recent arrivals from Britain. Of that 5,400,000, which is a fair chunk of 5 million. 400,000 had arrived from the British Isles, United Kingdom and Ireland these days, in the previous 10 years. Now think of that. 400,000 arrived in the previous 10 years. So when war's declared in 1914, it's not surprising that 20,000 of them enlist, just under half of whom were born in the United Kingdom. In other words, it's as if they're enlisting in London or in Manchester or somewhere. 40% of the blokes who landed at Gallipoli on the first day, the 25th of April, were born in the United Kingdom. 40% of the Australians who landed on that first day were born in the United Kingdom. So this is a country that's, in one sense, an outpost of the British Isles, a chunk of the British population that's on the other side of the world, as is New Zealand and other places. Now, some of them, of course, are third, fourth, fifth generation. Might still identify with Britain as home, but their idea of home might be somewhat romanticised. It's a newly federated place, so it had been 5 separate colonies. You might think it odd in Melbourne, for instance, there's a National Gallery in Melbourne, and there used to be a National Gallery in Sydney. The nation was Victoria, or New South Wales. Didn't have a National Gallery in Canberra until much, much later. So these 5 colonies, separate colonies, federated only in 1901, and they're still working out how to make the system work. And the First World War is a sort of station of the cross in that respect, particularly financially, although I won't go into that here tonight. This is not just a chunk of Britain, but it's a place that also sees itself as in advance of Britain. Women have the vote in Australia, they don't in Britain this time. We have in Australia an advanced social democracy. We have widows' pensions, various other things, child benefits, rudimentary system of industrial arbitration. All these things are seen as in advance of Britain. So a better British society than Britain itself. And some of these ideas, of course, are being imported back into Britain later on and had been earlier. Manhood franchise. Australia first and New Zealand, Britain later, for instance, in the 19th century. So it's a self-governing element of the British Empire that's intimately connected with Britain. Now, it's not just where the population and ideas come from, it's also where the money and the trade comes and goes from. If you think 60% of Australia's trade, 60% of Australia's trade in those days, 1914, earlier, was with the United Kingdom. So our major trading partner was on the other side of the world. Not China, not Japan, not even New Zealand, Britain. 6 out of every 10 grocery items you bought came from Britain. You went to the grocer's shop, anything in a tin, 6 out of 10 of them either locally made or imported from Britain. So a lot of the jobs in the Australian economy depended one way or another on export or import from Britain. It's another reason why people might want to get involved in the war. So you're a self-governing element in the British Empire, do what you like, got your own parliament, do what you like, but you are dependent economically in other ways on Britain. Another important element of the immigration story is that the major multiplier in the Australian colonial economy, major thing that made the Australian economy grow in the 19th century and still at the time of the First World War, wasn't gold, wasn't wool, although they were important. It was the very act of migration itself. It was the building of the infrastructure, building marvellous Melbourne, building those railways, building all of those other roads and things that made. So you kept expanding the economy on a promise, a bit like the Wild West in the US, the frontier movement. That frontier, although it's an urban frontier quite often in Australia by this stage. So what happens when the war breaks out is that immigration multiplier gets cut off. No migrants coming in anymore. Ships are being deployed for other purposes. So there's a hole in the economy, considerable hole. Australia's looking at something like 20-25% unemployment as a result of the outbreak of the war. Not surprising then that a lot of people enlist. They enlist because they're going to get a wage as well as defending the mother country and other things. So in the first year or so, enlistment's pretty strong in Australia, partly because of this. So that's a brief sketch of the background, the past being another country, as it were, in 1914, from an Australian point of view. What I intend to do now is to pick up a theme for each year of the war, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, from the edited book of documents, just to give you a flavour of what it's about, pick up some of the more important things. Some of you will have heard some of this before, some of you won't have done. Declaration of war in 1914, there's an election on in Australia, and the Labor leader, Andrew Fisher, wins the sort of slogan battle with his slogan suggested to him by Billy Hughes, that Australia will fight to the last man and to the last shilling, or to our last man and our last shilling, I think is what he actually said. That's interesting. A Labor leader representing a party that had an isolationist wing and was certainly more interested in local development than imperial ties, worried about Japan as a threat rather than Germany, but still winning an election on the basis of fighting in Britain's defence in Europe to the last man and the last shilling. The Liberal Party, Conservative Party at the time, said something similar, but it wasn't as catchy. But there were other reasons for electing Labor too, which I won't go into. Now they raise a division, 20,000 men, within 6 weeks. So war breaks out in August. By the middle of September, they've raised 20,000 men, plus a brigade on top of that, which is roughly half a division, another 10,000 of light horse. So, flocking to the colours. Now the first real action that Australian troops see, and there are little skirmishes in Port Phillip Bay and other places which we won't go into, the first real action is the destruction of the German radio station at Bitapaka outside Rabaul in German New Guinea. Now it's a recent book called Hell Bent, just come out, a chap called Doug Newton. He says, why did the Australians bother to attack a German radio station? They just wanted to be tough, just wanted to be part of the war. No, the hell they were. The Germans had a squadron of ships at Tsingtao in China, which operated down into German Micronesia and into German New Guinea. And their major connection to the German Kriegsmarine, the German Admiralty, was via these radio stations. There were 4 major radio stations, one of which was at Rabaul. Another one was at Yap further north, that was destroyed. One in Samoa, also destroyed, and another further across the Pacific, also destroyed by different forces, by the Japanese and the British and the New Zealanders. So this was an attack on the German nerve centre for the Pacific. Von Spee, the German admiral in charge at Tsingtao, said after the radio stations had been knocked out, I am now blind. I don't know, I don't have proper orders, I don't know where to go, I don't know where the British and Australian and Japanese fleets are. Now, it's worth dwelling on this fleet. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were the 2 heavy cruisers the Germans had, plus several light cruisers. And they were based in Tsingtao, but they ranged, as I say, across the whole of the North Pacific and into the South Pacific. They might have threatened the Australian troops and New Zealand troops amassing at Albany in Western Australia. They were at large, at sea. The one thing between them and Australia was the Australian fleet. The Royal Australian Navy, newly minted, 1913, ships sailed into the Sydney Heads, and they had as their flagship the HMAS Australia. It was a battle cruiser. A battle cruiser is a dreadnought light. Has the armament of a dreadnought, but the armour, the cladding of a lighter ship. Now the Germans had 8-inch guns. The Australia had 12-inch guns. which means that the Australia could zap the Germans before the Germans got within range. Von Spee knew this. He said in his diary, we discovered a few months ago, he said in his diary, "I will not sail further south than New Guinea because my whole squadron is outgunned by that one ship." Now, where was the Australia in September 1914? It was in the harbour at Rabaul, covering the destruction of the radio station. However, when the radio station was destroyed, what did the Australia do? It stayed there for another 2.5 months, until such times as it was discovered that the Germans had skedaddled across the Pacific. In that time, the Australian and New Zealand troops cooled their heels in Albany, waiting until the seas were safe for them to depart across the Indian Ocean, till Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were identified. They're eventually destroyed by the Royal Navy at the Falklands in December 1914. But they wouldn't have sailed that way had the Japanese not been sitting in Tsingtao and had the Australia not been sitting at Rabaul. So the Australia is a very important element in the securing of the South Pacific and of Australia in 1914. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, wanted to send the Australia and the New Zealand, which was another battle cruiser, to the North Sea in September 1914. The New Zealand and Australian governments said, "We will only send one." The New Zealand went and the Australia stayed behind because Australia wanted to protect its troops and its coastal shipping from the Germans. Once the Germans were dealt with, that was fine. You could then go off and fight in Europe, which is what the Australia did. Very interesting, I think. 1914. 1915. Gallipoli. Now, our focus, because we're looking at the diplomatic side of things, is not on the actual fighting at Gallipoli, but on the political inquiry into the campaign afterwards. So at the end of 1916 and into 1917, the British government had a parliamentary inquiry, not a royal commission, but almost a royal commission, into the Dardanelles failure and also the failure in Mesopotamia, failure of the Indian Army in Mesopotamia. Now, our representative on the Dardanelles Commission was Andrew Fisher, the Australian Prime Minister, who had been Prime Minister at the time of the Gallipoli campaign. He's replaced towards the end of 1915 by Billy Hughes as Prime Minister. Fisher comes over here as High Commissioner. He presides over the building of Australia House over the road, and he's on the Dardanelles Commission. Now, the Dardanelles Commission's barely mentioned in most Australian history books. They might mention that Fisher's on it. They might mention that one Keith Murdoch gave evidence to it. Keith Murdoch, father of Rupert Murdoch, journalist working in Melbourne at the time, and a very close friend of Andrew Fisher's. Now, when Murdoch was sent to Gallipoli by Fisher to report on what was happening, Murdoch's a young journalist, 30-year-old, sent to Gallipoli in August 1915, after the main push at Gallipoli, after Lone Pine, and so on. He's sent to report on what the officers think, to interview the officers, middle-ranking officers and the generals, and some of the Australian ones particularly, but also some of the others. He does so, and he writes an absolutely inflammatory letter, known as the Murdoch Letter these days. You can look it up and Google it on the internet if you like. Probably the most damning thing ever written about British troops ever. He just says they're like little boys, they don't know what they're doing, the generals are sitting on an island drinking champagne. A lot of pretty awful stuff. Not particularly true, although he's right about the failure of the strategy at Gallipoli. But what Murdoch's reporting is the feeling amongst the officers and the men, the feeling of betrayal over what happened at Gallipoli and how it was failing. And this is when London is tossing up whether to stay there or not. Now, the letter goes to Fisher. Fisher sends this letter, and it reads like an inflammatory editorial, sends the letter to Asquith, the British Prime Minister. Asquith is worried about this letter. He's worried that Fisher will use it to maybe withdraw his troops, and the Australian troops are about a quarter of the troops at Gallipoli, withdraw the troops, or ask for the recalling of the general, or make some other criticism. It's printed, the letter is printed as a British War Cabinet paper. It's extraordinary. When would an editorial be printed these days as a War Cabinet or as a cabinet paper? It doesn't happen. But it is. This is Asquith saving his hide, and he lasts as Prime Minister for another year or so. Churchill gets into trouble, several others get into trouble, the cabinet gets restructured, the general at Gallipoli, Hamilton, is sacked, a new general's put in and he's ordered to get out. Now, Murdoch isn't the only person pushing for this, but it's interesting that the independent line back to Fisher goes then back to the British cabinet and decisions are made very quickly thereafter. If the British cabinet had worked otherwise, I wouldn't have been at all surprised if the Murdoch letter hadn't appeared in the press and caused an uproar. So this is Andrew Fisher and Murdoch and others operating internally within the British system to try to change the minds of the main British strategists on the backs of what they're hearing from people at Gallipoli. An extraordinary story. Instrumental, maybe not the instrument, but certainly instrumental in the withdrawal from Gallipoli. Now you might say, out of the frying pan into the fire, they then go to the Western Front and it's even worse. But at least the Western Front was where the main action was and where the war would be decided. Now, on that commission, Murdoch, when he's interrogated in 1917, Murdoch is accused by a British general and one or two of the other British members of the commission of treason. You wrote this letter, you sent it to your Prime Minister, it wasn't properly censored, didn't go through the censors. And Murdoch said, I was there on the instructions of my Prime Minister. And there's an extraordinary intervention by Andrew Fisher. Fisher says, I am the Prime Minister, or was the Prime Minister of a sovereign parliament. A sovereign parliament, in other words, a parliament elected by the people with full powers, and I sent him there, and he was my representative. In other words, if you want to judge him, judge the whole of the Australian Parliament and Cabinet. They shut up, and Murdoch is let to go on. Now, this is 15 years, 15 more, 1917, 1931, whatever that is, 14 years before the Statute of Westminster gives Australia those powers formally. So we're doing it, we're asserting our rights as a sovereign nation before Versailles, before the Statute of Westminster, before the Balfour Declaration in 1926, before the Irish and the Canadians and the South Africans are saying, well, they are actually, the Canadians certainly are saying similar things at the time. In other words, we're behaving as a sovereign nation before we have the legal right to be one, and then we become one. Now, this is quite interesting to find these things being said. Now, this is, the supine Australian government that went to war and didn't argue the toss. They did. When things mattered, they did. Didn't mean they didn't want to fight the war, but I meant they wanted to fight the war on their terms as much as they possibly could, given all of those structural things that I said at the start of the talk. As an aside, Birdwood's evidence, Birdwood, the Australian British commander of the Australian troops at Gallipoli, 30 pages of his evidence at the Dardanelles Commission are well worth reading. I won't go into them in any detail, but he points out, for instance, that the Anzacs didn't land in the wrong place, they landed where he sent them. If they'd landed in the right place, then they'd have been annihilated. They landed in the wrong place, which was the right place, because that's where he sent them, gave them a fighting chance. He admits to the problems with medical treatment in the early days of the campaign, water shortages and various other things, but he also praises the troops for their behaviour, for their achievement. 1916, conscription. What surprised us was that we didn't find the word conscription mentioned once by the War Office in Britain or by the British government. The British government never asked Australia to conscript troops. We thought they would have discussed it. Britain introduces conscription, early 1916, by Act of Parliament. New Zealand follows. We thought that they'd be saying to us in Australia, you get your act together, do what we're doing, and conscript. They didn't. What they did say was, we need more troops. By this time, Billy Hughes is Prime Minister, and they're saying to Billy Hughes, if you want to know what we want in this war, we want you to recruit more troops. It's up to you how you do it. So the idea of conscripting troops and having a referendum, or two referenda over conscription, was an internal domestic Australian matter. Something Billy Hughes decided to do because he wanted to stay leader of the Labor Party. So he wanted to persuade the Labor Party. So rather than split the party, which he actually ended up doing, rather than split the party initially by having an act of parliament that the Conservatives would have supported, maybe some of Labor would have supported, he decided to have a referendum. We're the only country in the world up to 1916 that actually asks its people whether it wants to conscript its troops. Everyone else just does it. The Canadians have an election over conscription in 1917, late 1917. So they sort of follow. But we of course ask the people in Australia and the people say no. So voluntary recruitment remains the order of the day throughout the war. Now what's often not remarked on, people say Billy Hughes was a dictator. Well, he was and he wasn't, of course. What's not remarked on is he didn't have to have a conscription referendum at all. In that respect, he's a Democrat. He then goes to an election in May 1917, after having lost the conscription vote, goes to an election in May 1917 and wins that election hands down on a win-the-war ticket. So what was going on? Why did the Australian population vote against conscription but for the Hughes government a few months later? And it's not just the disintegration of the Labor Party. I mean, they're still there, they're still fighting the election. And if there'd been enough anger in the community, then you would have thought that Hughes and co would have been out on their ear. Now the answer, we think, is in Hughes's trade negotiations. Hughes in London in 1916 and again in early 1918, particularly in 1916, starts a series of negotiations with the British government about Australia's economic problem. The problem that can't get Australian goods to market. The wheat is rotting on the sidings. Even some of the minerals that are being mined, which are useful, of course, for the war, can't be shipped to London. The British government makes an extraordinary decision at Hughes's prompting. Now, it might have been another Prime Minister, but it happened to be Hughes. Hughes says to them, if you don't support our economy, we will not be able to recruit troops. And we mightn't even be able to stay in your empire. Our whole being within the empire rests on our economy. So you must buy our wool and our wheat and all of our other stuff as if it were peacetime. Not for economic reasons to do with your economy, but for economic reasons to do with our economy. And the British government decides to buy the wheat and the wool and all the other stuff at a reasonable price for the duration of the war. They sign up to a future agreement to do it. The two biggest wheat deals ever done up to that time happen in 1916 and 1917. Now, it's no coincidence then that the Australian economy gets propped up by these deals and the Country Party and others vote for their jobs in that 1917 election. Or that's what it looks like. Circumstantial, but that's what it looks like. So that explains why Hughes manages to win elections even though he's unpopular in other ways, I think. Now there's another run in 1917 on conscription. The big wheat deal is the big thing in 1917. That solution. The British buying. Now, it's interesting, there's questions asked in British Parliament of the Board of Trade in 1919, after the end of the war. Why did we buy all this stuff from the Australians and we never got it? Question in Parliament. And Sir William Runciman, the President of the Board of Trade, says, we did it for high political reasons. High political reasons. In other words, Australia would have left the empire, or might have thought about leaving the empire, if we hadn't done it. Now, there's a similar story about loans. New South Wales, particularly, is borrowing a lot of money on the London market for war purposes, and they spend it building dams and roads and railways, which are not really war purposes, they're development purposes. But they do it to keep the state economy running, which in one remove actually is a war purpose. And The British Treasury knows all of this, and the Bank of England knows it, and they look the other way. The snide little remarks and say, these disloyal people in New South Wales, and then somewhere higher up says, no, they're not really disloyal, you need to keep them employed. And that's how the financial side works. Versailles, 1918, 1919. Hughes, and I've spoken about this before, so I won't go into it in great detail. Hughes wants Australia's whole war effort to be paid for, £350 million worth. Everything that Australia spent on the war should be paid for by the Germans. Squeeze the Kaiser till the pips squeak. Lloyd George wants that for Britain, which is a hell of a lot more money. He says that before he gets re-elected in 1918. When he gets re-elected, the moment he gets re-elected after the election, he says, no, we won't squeeze Germany at all, Lloyd George says. For very good reason. If you destroy the German economy in 1918, Britain can't trade very well into Europe, and neither can the rest of Europe. So you need a Marshall Plan, or something like a Marshall Plan for Germany, to prop Germany up, to put Germany back on its feet so that you can trade with her, so that your economy doesn't collapse. And that applied to the Australian economy as well. So what Hughes is doing is playing a double dare game with the British and saying, give us some money, you either give it to us or you get out of Germany. Now, what did we get? We didn't get the money. The Americans said no. Lloyd George and the British said no. We didn't get the money, but we got the island of Nauru. The island of Nauru, if you know, is an island of phosphate. And the phosphate, over time, was worth at least £150 million. So Hughes got 2/3 of his reparations in direct phosphate, and whatever that phosphate produced by going onto Australian pasture and Australian crops, in terms of a multiplier there, you might say he got his reparations through the back door. And he shut up the moment he got Nauru, which tells you something. He managed to secure German New Guinea for Australia. Australia had occupied New Guinea. But you've got to remember that lots of other bits of the German Empire went to other people. So the Japanese were pushing in the same direction for the German islands north of the equator. The South Africans wanted Namibia and got it. And New Zealand got Samoa. So a lot of people wanted that. So Hughes got what a lot of other people wanted. He's got his bit of Nauru, New Zealand got a bit of Nauru, and so did Britain. So there were deals done. Whenever other people supported what Hughes wanted, he got what he wanted. If he went for something beyond what other people wanted, he didn't get it. So he needed the support of the rest of the British Empire or the French or somebody else. Even on the protection of the White Australia policy, he would not have been able to protect the White Australia policy had the Japanese not been given Tsingtao, which was the quid pro quo, and had the Americans not been wanting a white America policy at the same time, but not being game to say it. It's very interesting. If you look at Colonel House's correspondence, House is the main political advisor at Versailles to Woodrow Wilson, he says, Hughes is our patsy. Hughes is doing for us what we want done in terms of the protection of white America without our having to ask for it. Interesting. Now Hughes, of course, can't stand the League of Nations. He can't stand the 14 points, doesn't like Woodrow Wilson, and he criticises them vehemently within the British Empire delegation. He gets nowhere on that because nobody else can agree with him. As it turns out, of course, the League of Nations doesn't have the Americans in it after the war, and Woodrow Wilson loses office. Now, another element of Versailles worth noting, a lot of books will tell you that the Australians signed the Treaty of Versailles in their own right, as did the Canadians and the Irish and the South Africans and so on. But if you look at the actual treaty, we signed under B for Britain, British Empire. And all the other ones did too. So what happens is there are, I think it's 8 signatories for the British Empire. They're all signing on behalf of George V. The high contracting party in law at the Treaty of Versailles for the British Empire is the sovereign, King of Britain, who's also king of all these other places. And all the others, his ministers are signing for him. Now, if we'd been fully independent, of course, we'd have signed under A for Australia. However, Hughes then takes the treaty back to the Australian Parliament, and in a remarkable speech, very well worth reading, in September 1920, he says, I will tear this treaty up, send it back, if this Parliament does not ratify it. Now, Australia's Parliament had no right to ratify the Treaty of Versailles because they were already a signatory under the King of England, who was also the King of Australia. However, he says we are a sovereign Parliament and we're going to act as if we're a sovereign Parliament even if we're not, because the law doesn't mean anything really. The sovereignty comes from below, from the people in Australia, not from the Crown of England. The Crown of England, which is only there in an Australian sense because we back it. He doesn't go as far as that in his speech, but that's what he means. They, of course, vote in favour of the treaty. So we behave as a fully sovereign nation in our own parliament, even though there are all these political, legal niceties actually operating at Versailles. So we use our navy, we use our troops, we raise our troops, we negotiate our loans, all of those things as if it were today, but in a different set of circumstances, as it were, in terms of how we'd be prepared to jump. So we operate between empire and nation, and that's where we want to be. I edited a book some years ago with Bernard Attard where we talked about this as Australia's preferred position between the wars. What I hadn't realised was just how early we were behaving like this. We're doing it in 1915, 16, 17, 18. And it's not just Billy Hughes. Billy Hughes is following in tracks that other people have developed. So the choices over the Royal Australian Navy, the choice over conscription, the choices over Gallipoli, the wish list at Versailles, all of those things, and the trade deals, all done by a sovereign Australia, operating in an imperial context, as I say, which is where we want to be.
Thanks very much, Carl. I've taken miles of notes there just to get my head around it, actually, and it's a really fascinating story of independence and interdependence as regards Britain. I didn't actually say in my introduction to Carl that he is heading up a very major project gathering up documents as part of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Documents in Foreign Policy series.
Yeah, that's what this is.
That's what this
the
is
first
coming
go
out
at the
of.
introduction to the book.
Yeah, and that's the collection that will be out in April 2016. So for those that came in late, we're having our two papers. We're treating our two papers quite separately because Carl has a long-standing commitment. We'll have to leave before 7, so we're going to take questions for Carl's paper before we move on to Noah's. Do I have any questions from the floor before I jump in? Go, Michael.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
In terms of what happened after the First World War, did we get kind of cold feet about our legal independence from the Crown? Was there a point in maybe the question to being that, there was a change in sort of direction, but, we were sort of, if you're saying that we were assertive of our sovereignty in the First World War, that it would be strange that the same sort of movement wasn't pushing us to take up the independence that was being formally offered to us in the early 1930s.
Yeah, a good question. By then, Bruce and Menzies and Co. and Lyons have a different take. They think they're even more economically dependent than they were before, and they're disarming. The Royal Australian Navy is a much smaller operation, and they think that by signing the Statute of Westminster, that will give Britain a legal out. A legal out that the South Africans and the Canadians and the Irish want. But that Australia and New Zealand, looking at Japan, perhaps don't want. It's a silly argument, actually, because the British in 1941-42 are going to do what the British are going to do, regardless of what the legal situation might imply. But yeah, we don't sign the Statute of Westminster until 42. New Zealand doesn't do it until 47. But my argument would be that we behave differently than what our legal status gives us, and that waxes and wanes depending on circumstance. Well, that's true. I mean, these guys, I mean, the Canadians and the South Africans and the Irish had embassies set up in 1921, 22, before Balfour, before the Statute of Westminster. So it's really just catching up. That's true. We decided not to catch up, legally speaking, And that's Menzies. Menzies is Attorney General in the 30s who keeps refusing, interestingly. Wrongly, I think, but anyway.
Professor Bridge, you were talking about the slack in the Australian economy brought on by war. How much of that slack could have been taken up by munitions manufacture, and to what extent was Britain responsible for Australia's defence?
Well, Britain says it's responsible for Australia's defence, and the Royal Navy becomes the main defence shield, supposedly. Once the Australian Navy sails outside the 10-mile limit, then they are under the command of the Royal Navy. So all of that is said. But Fisher then says, we're going to keep our ship here and we're not going to pay for it otherwise. So it doesn't matter, again, what the legal situation is. It matters what's going on. The Royal Navy is weaker than the Australian Navy in the Pacific in 1914. They've withdrawn so many vessels. Singapore doesn't exist as a naval major base. The major base is in Hong Kong, one old battleship and a couple of light cruisers. So the Australia and the new Australian cruisers and New Zealand's navy together are the strongest imperial force, as it were, the British force in the Pacific. So Britain is legally responsible for the defence of Australia. It doesn't mean Britain's going to do it. Well, Australia does have a munitions factory for manufacturing light munitions, but we don't have the industrial capacity, and we would then have still had to got the stuff to the front, and that meant shipping, and the ships were being used elsewhere most of the war. And one of the reasons why Billy Hughes buys the tramp steamers in 1916 is that there just aren't enough ships even for the Australian coastal trade.
So there wasn't generally a worry about a threat to the Australian coastline?
Not once the Germans have gone. Japan is an ally. They're a bit suspicious of the Japanese, but they don't think they're going to move in this war. And they were right. The Japanese, of course, were much more interested in dividing up China, as they were in the Second World War, actually.
Who paid the 20,000? I mean, that's a quick amount of time to suddenly start paying 20,000 people.
Australia did. The Australian government did, yeah.
Okay.
And the money was borrowed not in London for the war effort, but at home.
Right, okay.
So they started war loans, and people, it's a very interesting story, actually. The war loans are subscribed all the way through the war, even though the economy's shrinking. So it says something about how threatened people felt.
And how did you get paid then? I'm sorry, this is very. Do you know how they got so that? How quickly would you get paid if you'd signed up?
Oh, I think pretty.
Oh, I suppose you got. Yeah, you're being looked after straight away.
I think it's usually monthly in arrears in those days, but they fed you straight away, and they gave you clothing.
Yeah, okay, so you didn't need much.
But $6 a day. $6
that's
a day was was it 4 times the British soldiers' pay? So it wasn't a bad, as long as you didn't get killed or maimed, it wasn't a bad thing.
That's a good deal. Go.
My name is David Out. This question maybe I want is something about diplomacy, but I'm intrigued as to how 2 German battleships were able to make it from, I think, West New Guinea, all the way across the Pacific Ocean, round clear North Wago, up to, I think, Coronel, where they met there.
No, they didn't meet at Falklands. The Coronel they won. That's off Valparaiso. Well, they had several caches of coal, including one on Easter Island. And food. So they had bases, but they also raided several islands, including Tahiti. Took what they could. The French burnt all the coal in Tahiti, so they couldn't re-coal. They got as far as Valparaiso, which is Chile is neutral at the time, and they were re-coaled there. But the problem was they fought a naval action against the Royal Navy and won at Coronel, used up half of their ammunition. The bloke at Coronel just didn't know they were there and just sailed straight into them, and he was completely outgunned, a bloke called Craddock. But meanwhile, the Royal Navy knew what was going on. The British in Valparaiso reported their presence there. They knew that he was going to run for the Atlantic. And the Admiralty had sent 2 battle cruisers to the Falklands. They then fed a message, a fake message, to poor old von Spee, saying, ordering him to destroy the British radio station and coaling station in the Falklands. That was a British order in German sent to him. He sailed straight into the British fleet. End of the of the German squadron. Only one of them survived. It was dreadful. So that's the end of the naval threat in the Pacific. Yeah.
What happened to all the wheat?
It rotted.
Oh, really?
Most of it. Yeah, only about I think about a tenth of it more actually got to market. It didn't matter. I mean, you sold
No,
it.
that's
It's already sold. In fact, it creates a demand for more at the end of the war.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the official historians, there's a lovely sentence, we known as Scott's official history, which says the mice had a field day.
That's good stuff. Do we have any other questions for Carl before we move on? Well, we'll give him a clap now because he might have to duck out. But please, thanks, Carl, for a very wonderful take.
Thank you very much.
In fact, there's a really interesting story there about new awareness of independence, giving a sense of independence, which we might find in our next paper. I have to say, the next paper is the subject of one of my prouder tweets because an unnamed Indigenous Australian comic who has a large amount of Twitter followers made a comment on the 11th of November about not forgetting the black diggers, and I was able to reply immediately with information about our paper on the black diggers, which he retweeted. So I was feeling very, very happy about that. So
Did you refer to me by name in this tweet?
I put
I hope not. I'm
the
just
link.
curious.
I put the link
Okay.
to the paper.
Great.
Yes, yes. I said we are doing a paper on black diggers.
I've been
Yes. No, no, no.
retweeted by all sorts of strange people at
Oh,
various
yeah, no,
times,
no,
and
no,
I
no,
don't
no,
tweet,
no.
so.
Yes, there you go. So, as I introduced before, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Noah Riseman, a senior lecturer in history at the Melbourne campus of the Australian Catholic University, and he'll be speaking to us about Aboriginal Australians and the First World War. And I'm going to operate the slides.
Yep, it's just on the desktop if you just want to open it. Cool. Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks for hosting me. I would just first quickly acknowledge I'm originally from the United States, you can tell from my American accent, but currently working in Barcelona, live in Melbourne, and so I do want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional owners of Melbourne, the land in which I normally live. I want to start by mentioning that on the 10th of November 2013, so basically a year ago from now, there was a ceremony in Adelaide that dedicated a war memorial to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who've served in the Australian Armed Forces from the Boer War through till today. And one of the themes that was permeating all of the dedication speeches was about how during both the First and the Second World Wars, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service personnel fought bravely for Australia, yet returned home to continuing discrimination. And Indigenous contributions to Australia's military history, for the most part, went unrecognized, became forgotten in the national story. Frank Lampard, who was the deputy chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial Committee, he delivered a very impassioned speech in which he declared to a very resounding applause, "I'm proud to say that lack of recognition ends today." Slide, please. The memorial in Adelaide, which is in the upper left photo, represents one of several initiatives in the new millennium to commemorate Indigenous military service. Members of the Perth-based organization honoring Indigenous war graves, they travel to grave sites of deceased Indigenous diggers to place commemorative headstones. That is the upper right, is from one of their services. In Redfern, in Sydney, which is a very large Indigenous community, they hold a coloured diggers march to honour Indigenous servicemen and women every Anzac Day since 2007. Bottom left corner. In capital cities, the Department of Veterans Affairs organizes services during Reconciliation Week every year. In January of this year, the Sydney Festival showcased the new play Black Diggers, which depicted the experiences of Aboriginal servicemen in the First World War. This year's NAIDOC Week theme was Serving Country, Centenary and Beyond. And these are some of the more high-profile examples that complement commemorative activities in local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the country. And I do think such events, they are all contributing to a gradual awakening among the Australian community about the histories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander military service. But of course, this process of incorporating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander military service into the national consciousness does take time. And of course, there's a lot more work to do. Even with this growing awareness of the history, the majority of non-Indigenous Australians know little, if anything, about Indigenous participation in the armed forces. And just to demonstrate how central their contributions were, I want to quickly just tell you an anecdote, which is actually from the Second World War. So on the 19th of February 1942 was the first Japanese air raid on Darwin, resulting in the deaths of at least 243 people. What's less known, though, is that amidst this raid, a Japanese Zero was damaged and crashed on Melville Island. The Japanese pilot survived, encountered a group of Tiwi Islanders who ran into the bush, leaving a baby behind. And the Japanese pilot picked up this baby. A Tiwi man named Matthias Ulungura snuck up behind the Japanese with a tomahawk and said, "Stick 'em up." And this is the story of the first Japanese prisoner of war ever captured on Australian soil, captured by an Aboriginal man. And I'm curious, just by a show of hands, how many people have heard this story before? Of course you have. That's my partner over there. He's heard this story before. You heard it. You heard it at a... But look, that's fine. The point I'm getting at, though, is there was one time I relayed this anecdote and every hand went up in the room, and that was when I presented to an Indigenous audience. Indigenous people know this history. It's non-Indigenous Australians who have a little bit of catching up to do. So that was from the Second World War, and the rest of today's talk I'm gonna focus on Indigenous service in the First World War, as well as the ways that those contributions rapidly disappeared from, or more accurately, I might say never appeared, in the public memory. Much of the recent commemorations has focused on participation in both world wars as a form of what we might call reconciliatory history. I'm instead going to look at the often exploitative nature of military service. And I should say, of course, Aboriginal people, and in this case, First World War, it is Aboriginal people. There's only been one identified Torres Strait Islander. So for the First World War, I am talking primarily Aboriginal people who did provide valiant service that absolutely needs to be honored. We also need to recognize that from the government or from the military perspective, often they were being used as a form of propaganda. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So next slide, please. So turning to the First World War, on the 17th of February 1917, this letter appeared in the Brisbane Courier, titled Open Letters Number 22 to Queensland's Half-Caste Aboriginals. The author wrote, "The big feller thinks the time hasn't come yet when we should ask you, Aboriginal people, to go away and fight for our little white children. And so the only thing you can do is to stay back and shame the superior white man who can go, and ought to go, but won't." In the letter, the author expressed some sympathy with Aboriginal desires to serve, but it wasn't really challenging existing regulations against Aboriginal enlistment in the AIF. Instead, it was actually reinforcing Aboriginal people's inferior status in Australian society, and what the letter was doing was using rejected Aboriginal applicants as propaganda to disgrace white men who had yet to enlist. Next slide, please. This letter in the Brisbane Courier, it probably had little influence on white enlistment rates, but what it did do was draw attention to high Aboriginal rejection rates. At the outbreak of the war, military authorities and the Commonwealth government, they were uncertain about whether or not Aboriginal men, particularly men of mixed descent who at the time were so-called half-castes, we don't use that word anymore, whether or not they should be allowed to enlist. The Defence Act had exempted Aboriginal people from compulsory military training and compulsory wartime service because they were, quote, persons who are not substantially of European origin or descent. And you see that phrase quite a bit in both world wars, not substantially of European origin or descent. So the legislation, it released Aboriginal people from compulsory military service. Whether or not they could voluntarily enlist was ambiguous. But in the early months of the war, the recruiter's handbook explicitly said, quote, Aborigines and half-castes are not to be enlisted. This restriction is to be interpreted as applying to all colored men. Despite this regulation, though, we do know that by the end of the First World War, somewhere between 800 to 1,000 Aboriginal men wound up serving overseas. Based on testimonies, the records, we know that the actual combat, the actual soldier experience for them tended not to be very different from their non-Indigenous comrades. But what does stand out in the records is the enduring discrimination that they continued to face at institutional levels and the enduring prejudice that they confronted in Australian society after the war. Now, because Aboriginal men had to circumvent the AIF regulations in order to exist, their agency was actually quite marked in deciding to sign up for the war. Some of the common motivations to serve include better wages, loyalty, hopes for a better life after the war. So for instance, in 1914, the average wage an Aboriginal man earned in civilian life was 7 shillings and 6 pence per week. In the army, a man earned 6 shillings per day. So just signing up is an economic opportunity. You see what's on that if I'm on the right slide? Yep, I'm on the right slide. The notion of loyalty tends to be the most cited reason for why Aboriginal men decided to enlist. In their service records, there are letters with references to the Union Jack and the Crown. Veterans and their families writing to government officials often talked about loyalty to king and country. And after the war, this issue of loyalty became intertwined with Aboriginal people's calls for equal rights. For instance, William Cooper of the Australian Aborigines League, he talked about his son dying, quote, for his king on the battlefield. In a letter to Prime Minister Joseph Lyons in 1938, William Cooper wrote, "At least 1,000 Aborigines were among the first to enlist in the defense of the British empires in the 1914 to 18 war, and for which empire they gave their lives. It was a thankless task for them, no thanks being given for the valuable services rendered. We get no encouragement, and the result of this neglect appears to be that we are looked upon as a useless race and greatly misrepresented thereby." There were other invocations of loyalty, again, this tends to be after the war, that were just asking for Indigenous communities to be kept intact. In a 1926 letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, pleading for the government not to close Warrangiesta Mission, an Aboriginal man named James Murray wrote, "During the Great War, a number of our boys from Warrangiesta went overseas in khaki, and some did not come back, a nephew of mine among them. Do you think, sir, it was for this that they died?" More often than not, these references to Aboriginal loyalty appeared after the war, used retrospectively to argue for Aboriginal rights. But rarely did the invocation of Aboriginal loyalty successfully influence government policies during the interwar period. So looking at these actual policies during the war, so from the formation of the first AIF in August of 1914 until March of 1917, being Aboriginal was rarely mentioned explicitly in the records as ground for rejecting recruits. Usually instead, in the records, you'd see the racial rejections coming under the category medical grounds. There were, of course, some Aboriginal men who did manage to circumvent the rules. Some pretended to be Italian, some pretended to be Maori, and even though Maori are not European, they were allowed. Maori in New Zealand had always been treated better, even Maori living in Australia. And there were other instances when recruiting officers who had to meet their quotas just overlooked the racial restrictions and let them in. Next slide, please. But what really changed things was after the devastating 23,000 casualties at Pozieres and, building off the last paper, the failure of the first conscription referendum. So in March of 1917, there were changes made to allow Aboriginal men with one white parent to enlist. These reforms, they were primarily about boosting numbers, because there were worries that the AIF would lose its position as an independent force within the British Empire. Queensland's chief protector of Aborigines, J.W. Bleakley, he wrote, "Large numbers immediately volunteered, all claiming to come within that category of half-caste or part Aborigine. The recruiting officers scratched their heads. As one said, some of these are the blackest half-castes I've ever seen." This increase in Aboriginal soldiers after March of 1917 came from across Australia, with the notable exception of Western Australia, where the recruiters continued to practice the pre-March 1917 regulations. But we do still know there were at least 20 Aboriginal men from Western Australia who did serve. Some of these men who signed up later in the war, they had previously been rejected for being Aboriginal. Historian Timothy Weingard, he's analyzed the statistics of 545 known soldiers, and he says that of these known soldiers, 83 were killed, 123 wounded, and another 17 became prisoner of war. Including the POWs, the casualty rate is 41%, as compared to 65% across the entire AIF. Loosening these restrictions on Aboriginal enlistment, it was certainly a boon for Aboriginal people because of this notion of war service as an employment prospect. But the military and the Commonwealth government, they were by no means endorsing a principle of equality or even improved rights for Aboriginal servicemen. Rather, this decision strictly came through military lenses to boost numbers. Next slide, please. Furthermore, it wasn't just Aboriginal men whom the military hoped to acquire. Authorities hoped they could propagandize Aboriginal service in order to recruit more white Australians. For instance, there was a story in the Brisbane Courier from the 15th of May 1917 that reported on the recruitment of Aboriginal men at Barramba Station, which nowadays is Cherbourg. The final sections of the article talked about an Aboriginal man who allegedly said, "My word though, when our Barramba boys get into Brisbane on the 24th, meaning Empire Day, they'll make some of the beer bums leaning against the veranda post look up. That'll shame 'em, eh?" There was one recruitment campaign in Queensland in 1917 that included an Aboriginal man in uniform carrying a placard that read, "By cripes, I'll fight for white Australia." The Advertiser in Adelaide, it talked about the enlistment of 5 Guntijmara brothers from Victoria as, quote, "A striking example, 2 eligible white men has been furnished by a half-caste family at Haywood named Lovett." So consistently, these headlines, they're targeting white men, and they're using Aboriginal men to disgrace the white men who were eligible but still had not signed up. Now, for those who were enlisted, the service records, the limited writings about Aboriginal service suggest that once they were in the AIF, there was little, if any, difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous experiences. Overseas, Aboriginal men, they too experienced the horrors of trench warfare. They too were gassed, maimed, shot, suffered high casualty rates. They too were captured, lived as prisoners of war. They too wrote to their families, wrote about homesickness. They too formed the bonds of mateship with other diggers, sharing a sense of duty and adventure. Next slide, please. This isn't to say that there were no incidents of racism in the first AIF. Doreen Cartignery, she tells a story about her uncle Eustace Garney Wilson when he visited a nightclub in Paris. And she says, "Uncle Garney asked for 2 beers, but when he was getting served, one of the military policemen told the barman not to serve Uncle Bill as he was an Aboriginal from Australia and was under the Aboriginal Act. And Aborigines were not allowed to be served alcohol. This angered Uncle Garney and Uncle Bill, and a fight would have started if the military police had not stepped in." Chris Saunders, a Guntijmara man whose son Reg Saunders has become the most high-profile Aboriginal serviceman from the Second World War and Korea, he recalls an anecdote when a man on his ship refused to sit next to him because he was black. Saunders confronted the man and, quote, "Next day he came looking for me and we sat down to eat together. He turned out to be the best mate I had on the ship. We went through a fair bit of action together and we stayed good friends after the war until he died." So I should emphasize, we do get some stories of racism, but they tend to be isolated incidents. More often than not, the testimonies talk about camaraderie in the forces. Aboriginal men received significant praise for their work during the First World War. Captain J. Sidney Bartlett, he later wrote, quote, "In the early days of the war, they, Aboriginal soldiers, were looked down upon by many officers and diggers as being undependable under heavy fire. But this opinion was soon brushed aside after the hard fighting in Palestine, and the Aboriginals received the respect of all their fellow diggers." By the end of the war, we know somewhere between 800 and 1,000 served. Of the 545 whom Timothy Weingart has written about, we know that 3 Aboriginal Australians were awarded the Distinguished Combat Medal, 9 the Military Medal, 3 were mentioned in dispatches, and 1 was awarded the Military Cross. While barriers were being broken overseas, racial discrimination endured at home. And this would impact on the lives of the families of Aboriginal servicemen. There were discrepancies in Aboriginal policies across all the states and territories, and that accounts for some of the variations in treatment. So for instance, in South Australia, Aboriginal men under the age of 21 needed the consent of the Chief Protector of Aborigines to enlist. In Queensland, part of their pay was set aside in accounts under the control of the Department of Native Affairs, which means it wound up becoming part of the stolen wages. Restrictions on accessing those accounts also extended to the wives of Aboriginal soldiers. In Victoria, war widows were not allowed to access widows' pensions if they were living on an Aboriginal reserve. In South Australia, the pensions for deceased servicemen's children were placed in trust funds. Next slide, please. Both institutional and individual discrimination endured for Aboriginal veterans when the war ended. Veterans and their families were still segregated. They were denied access to public spaces such as hospitals, sporting events, schools. It was still illegal for Aboriginal veterans to consume alcohol, even though many of them had been drinking quite a bit in France and Britain. Some veterans applied for exemption certificates so that they could enjoy the privileges or the rights, perhaps, afforded to non-Indigenous Australians. We know of at least one documented case where an Aboriginal veteran protested when he was denied an exemption certificate in Queensland. The Chief Protector called him an agitator and threatened to banish him to Palm Island. And trust me, or anyone who's historians of Indigenous Australia, you did not want to be banished to Palm Island. In a case in New South Wales, an ex-serviceman named Mick Flick, he complained about the segregation of his children from Collarimbury Public School. The Aborigines Protection Board threatened to remove his children if he kept this up. And the threat of child removal was quite real. Some Aboriginal soldiers' children were even forcibly removed while they were serving overseas becoming part of the stolen generations. The most blatant display of discrimination against Aboriginal veterans came through the denial of benefits. There were conflicting policies on Aboriginal eligibility for veterans' benefits, summarized best in a memo from the Ministry of Defence, which, that is it, yep, it says, the fact of an Aboriginal having served with the AIF does not remove him from the care or supervision exercisable by the board appointed for the protection of Aborigines under the Aborigines Act, New South Wales. Neither does it relieve that board of its duties towards the Aboriginal. An Aboriginal who has served as an Australian soldier is entitled to the benefits under the Australian Soldiers Repatriation Act, and nothing in the Aborigines Act denies the right to such Aboriginal of the full use and enjoyment of any benefits granted to him by his department. So essentially what they were saying was Aboriginal soldiers were entitled to veterans' benefits, but they were also still under the Act. So from a practical standpoint, this meant that the state laws effectively disenfranchised and denied Aboriginal people access to the benefits. So for instance, Rufus Gordon Rigney, his application for a pension to the Repatriation Commission in 1925 was denied because he had low wages. It was denied on the grounds he had free rent, firewood, and milk at Point Macleay Mission Station in South Australia. Many Aboriginal soldiers did not receive funeral benefits or military burials. Aboriginal veterans had difficulties accessing war gratuities because the state restrictions on Aboriginal people handling money. The franchise, the vote, the symbol of equal citizenship rights and access to the political system continued to be denied to Aboriginal veterans. It wasn't extended to Aboriginal veterans until 1949, after the Second World War. And the most blatant denial of veterans' benefits came in the form of soldier settlement schemes. During the war, every state parliament passed legislation to provide returned servicemen with an opportunity to apply for land grants. In Victoria and in New South Wales especially, some of the land that was set aside for returned servicemen had actually previously been Aboriginal reserves that were closed, sold off by the state governments against the wishes of the Aboriginal residents. Because soldier settlement schemes were under the control of state governments instead of the Federal Department of Repatriation, Aboriginal people's status under state protection acts effectively denied them access to soldier settlement. We do know of 2 Aboriginal veterans who were granted soldier settlement blocks, one in New South Wales, one in Victoria, both because the authorities didn't realize they were Aboriginal when they applied for them. In the immediate years after the war, I should say there were, of course, some individual advocates for the rights of Aboriginal veterans. More often than not, these were the white men who fought alongside them. For instance, a June 1919 conference of the Northern Rivers District sub-branch of the Returned Soldiers and Sailors Imperial League, which is currently the Returned and Services League, the RSL, took up the issue of discrimination against Aboriginal veterans. The conference passed a motion calling upon, quote, the Minister for Defence to adopt necessary measures to secure full civil rights to Aborigines and half-castes of the Commonwealth who have served or are serving with the AIF or any branch of the naval or military forces in recent or previous campaigns. At an Anzac Day service in Healesville, Victoria in 1932, one of the white speakers talked about his relationship with an Aboriginal soldier, and the local newspaper reported, one of the speaker's best friends during the war was a Queensland Aborigine whom he taught to read and write. He had become his brother, and was his brother still. No one fully understood the wonderful bond existing between the men of the AIF. The wonderful message of the AIF was not forgotten, and the bond became yearly stronger. Next slide, please. Historian Philippa Scarlett, though, she argues that these examples of RSL members fighting for the rights of Aboriginal people, these were actually exceptions to the norm. At the sort of larger structural level, RSLs took little, if any, interest in the rights of Aboriginal veterans. In rural areas especially, the RSLs were active in campaigns for discrimination and segregation of public facilities like schools. There's also evidence of RSLs not admitting Aboriginal veterans or only allowing them to enter on Anzac Day. Aboriginal men were usually relegated to the back of Anzac Day marches, and that is if they were even allowed to participate at all. Occasionally, individual members of the RSL publicly protested against the discrimination practiced within the organization. Ex-Private James Bennett of Cooktown, he wrote a letter to the Cairns Post opposing the Cairns RSL's decision to support the segregation of Cairns state schools. And he wrote, "The Returned Soldiers Association is non-political, non-sectarian. Let it be also a non-racial association. As a soldier who has been in the 15th Battalion of the AIF and served on the peninsula of Gallipoli, France, Belgium, I object very strongly to the slur cast upon my half-caste comrades of the 15th Battalion, some of whom paid the supreme penalty both in Palestine, in the light horse units, and other spheres of the war. Voices like this, though they were lone ones, by the mid-1930s, this notion of recognizing and rewarding Aboriginal service was pretty much too long past. So, despite providing valiant service, being treated as equals on the battlefield, Australian society was not prepared to accept Aboriginal veterans as equals after the war. In some veterans' cases, this meant a gradual descent into depression. Other Aboriginal servicemen survived as they were accustomed to before the war, with their kin as support while navigating these restrictions imposed by white Australia. Though many Aboriginal veterans became disenchanted after the war, this of course did not take away from their valiant war work and the pride that they maintained in their service. Historian Ribby Taylor, she writes of a veteran, Tiger Stanford Simpson, and she says, "John Connolly told me there were two things that were an obsession with Tiger as he got older, being an Anzac and having an Aboriginal background." When the Second World War broke out, some Aboriginal veterans signed up for the Volunteer Defence Corps, or the Second AIF. Some families, such as the Lovitts and the Saunders most prominently, they continued family traditions of military service through the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, even as recently as Afghanistan. The Lovitt family, I always get the number wrong. I want to say it was 26, the number of Lovitts who've served in the armed forces. Don't quote me on that number. The Department of Veterans Affairs building in Canberra has been renamed Lovitt Tower after the Lovitt family. They're from Western Victoria, Guntaj Mara mob, who most recently one of them has been serving in Afghanistan. There were other Aboriginal communities, Point Macleay Mission, for instance, that developed these very strong military traditions. So I do just have a few final remarks that will return to my opening points about commemorations. It's really been in the last 10 years that remembering Indigenous service has gradually filtered into the public consciousness, and this really has largely been due to the work of Indigenous organizations, including Indigenous veterans groups. To their credit, the Commonwealth and the state governments, they have been very receptive to commemorating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander military service. The Australian War Memorial, they employ an Indigenous liaison officer. Supposedly they're making a conscious effort to integrate Indigenous Australians within the remodeling of its exhibition that's reopening on Anzac Day next year. I say supposedly because that's what they say. I don't know. It hasn't reopened yet. We'll see. The Department of Veterans Affairs, they now include Indigenous officers. That's quite recent. DVA, the Department of Defence, the Australian War Memorial, and the National Archives of Australia have all signed on as linkage partners on the Australian Research Council project led by Mick Dodson at the National Centre for Indigenous Studies, which Ian mentioned at the beginning I'm a chief investigator on. And as part of this project, investigators have been traveling across Australia, collecting oral histories and documents, and we're going to produce the first comprehensive history of Indigenous military service from the Boer War till the present. And these are some of the efforts to rectify these enduring silences about Indigenous contributions to Australia's defence. So no longer is Indigenous service considered an aberration or propaganda or a spectacle. Slowly it is being recognized as part of an integral part of Australian history. And of course I do support these initiatives, but cautiously. And where I'm a bit wary is I think it's too easy to appropriate this sort of positive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander military service history without looking at the wider colonial and historical context. So at the commemorations, regularly there are acknowledgements that men and women went off to war, came back to discrimination, but they don't really talk about the discrimination, and they don't talk about these exploitative and propaganda motives to employ Indigenous service. And I kind of worry that we're heading down the path of the United States, where stories like the Navajo Code Talkers have now very much become part of the national war narrative, while sort of wider Native American history, especially post-war discriminatory policies like termination and relocation, are not known. And another contentious question is, how do we commemorate the frontier wars, which Henry Reynolds has written about in his new book, Forgotten War, where he's arguing that we need to commemorate the frontier wars as part of the national military history. And that's something which I and most Australian military historians also agree with. He also argues, where I very much disagree with him, he also argues that by commemorating Indigenous service from the Boer War through the present, we therefore forget the frontier wars. He sort of looks at this as an either-or thing. I completely disagree with that premise. But I do agree that we need to see military service in its larger context rather than just as an isolated, positive story of reconciliation. Thank you.
fascinating history that we've just heard there. Do we have any questions?
Do we have the extent of, you mentioned about stolen wages. I'm just curious about that. Do you have sort of any sort of figures, or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, look, Rosalind Kidd has done quite a bit of work on the stolen wages in Queensland, and the stolen wages. There's someone else who did work on them in Victoria, and there is some investigation going into it. The extent to which it was veterans' pensions, I'm actually not quite sure about, but she does mention it among all of these other entitlements that were taken and cordoned off by the Queensland government, included also the entitlements that they were receiving. The exact figures I don't know.
What was the? I was really struck with the virulence of the discrimination after the First World War, and obviously we're well aware of the long historical reasons for that. But one sense there must have been very specific, local, contemporary reasons for the activity, if you like, of the discrimination. And I'm wondering whether it is the segregation of the schools, or is it the kind of everyday sense of contamination at a remote country level? What's
I think what it is it's the wider context of white Australia policy, contamination, secular policy. They don't care that these people went off to war. With the exception, and the notable exception of the white men who served with them. You're still Aboriginal. I don't care that you went off to war. So I think it's just, the war, it's not an aberration. It's still part of this context, and they don't see them as any different.
So it's sort of like, although I can have you as a mate, I'd still be worried about your kids going to school with mine. Is that kind of the...
I think often in these areas where they were still opposing them, they may have been, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's a tough one to answer. I think
it's just really, it's a virulent motivation, that's all.
It's this sort of, well, in the military it was different.
Yeah.
Now we're back here, it's back to the same. And I think that might also be something where perhaps a lot of them were RSLs in areas where there wasn't necessarily a large Indigenous contingent who served. Look, 800 to 1,000, at the end of the day, that isn't necessarily a large number of people. The stats show that most came from, the largest numbers were from Queensland and New South Wales. Victoria, percentage-wise, Richard Broome has calculated that 1/3 of Indigenous men of proper age served. So quite high, but in Victoria you have a much smaller Indigenous population at this time. Tasmania, there's been some work recently done on Tasmania and Aboriginal people who served, including, it's recently been found, the first Aboriginal officer was a Tasmanian Aboriginal man in the First World War, which the War Memorial won't officially recognize. But Tasmania, of course, they say they don't have Aboriginal people. So it's...
Does the, talking about numbers of Aborigines who fought or volunteered in the First World War, does the eagerness of Aborigines to fight for Australia, for the government, for the ruling regime, indicate a willingness and a desire to take part in that country?
It does, and that's what the people, especially in the 1930s, were arguing. When they were arguing for civil rights, they were arguing for equal rights. They were arguing for the vote, for these restrictions to be removed. They said, hey, look, we went off to war. We're part of this country. We want to be part of this country. Give us the rights. So that is absolutely part of it.
It's that simple. I mean, what I'm saying is, what I'm asking is, were they saying, we don't reject this society. We realize that we don't really have much choice but to take part in this society that now runs this country. Were they saying that? Were they saying we're just doing it for the money, or we do it because we get a better job afterwards, after we might get a bit of respect? Were they actually sort of aspiring to the same things? I want to live in a suburb and have a nice little car and two.
It varies from case to case. It varies from case to case. And what I do find interesting...
Up to the white society, in other words.
Yes, it varies from case to case. And I think one example that does fit that model is a gentleman named Douglas Grant, who was an Aboriginal man who, as a baby, was rescued from a massacre. And the story's a bit convoluted, but essentially there was a massacre of Aboriginal people in the frontier. He, as a baby, was the one survivor. And a Scottish couple, who were a white middle-class family in Sydney, took him in. They raised him, and they raised him as a loving son. He went off to war. He wanted to be a part of regular Australian society, mainstream Australian society. There would have been other men who was the same thing. there would have been other men who it really was just, I can get some money out of this, support my family. It's very hard to generalize, but the one thing I would say is often the men who are arguing, we want to be part of Australian society, you tend to hear that after the war. You don't tend to hear it during the war. It tends to be in the 1920s and 1930s used as a justification for wanting equal rights. So I guess with that, there is this question, was that actually why they signed up? Or later on after the war, are they trying to invoke this? And I can't completely answer that.
But they want equal rights. They want equal rights to live as Aborigines, but they want equal rights to live in that suburban Sydney.
In the 1930s, it was a bit of both. It's a bit of both. That's the discourse of the activism of the 1930s. They are asking for rights to land, but they're not asking for rights to land based on traditional connection, as you tend to find in the 1960s and 70s. It's more about, well, we want to participate in the economy. Give us some land. Give us some farms that we can farm.
Well, that's very interesting because, you know, the view I get from Australia as we read in this country or some of these papers and so on, is that one of the problems, supposedly, with this people is that they don't want to integrate.
That's not true.
Whereas it seems to me, as far as before the First World War, they were wanting to take part in society.
There's a difference between integration and assimilation. Integration they're fine with, it's assimilation they don't want.
Just in terms of
But
the,
those are also very much 1930s, 40s, 50s constructs though. Nobody's using the word assimilation during the First World War.
in terms of the representation history of Aboriginal people, I found both papers actually really fascinating for thinking about the triad of Archie, Frank and Zach in the film Gallipoli, which is so much part of Australians' self-myth-making about the war, and just to hear that story about the Western Australian recruitment of Aboriginal people, and in a sense to see the debate about whether Australia should support an imperial military force is distributed across Frank, the Irish Australian, and Archie, the English Australian, and the question of the Aboriginal.
They do a great play on it in the play Black Diggers, which was brilliant, I have to say. It was fantastic. I saw it in January. There's a bit in it where, there's that scene in Gallipoli where Mel Gibson and the other guy are chatting with that man in the desert, and they're like, why are we going off to war? Well, there's a scene in Black Diggers where there's a white guy explaining to the Aboriginal people why they should go off to war. And the white guy says, well, why don't you imagine if your land is invaded and these people come in and they take it all, and it's pretty funny. It's like a piss take on the Gallipoli scene, but also obviously the audience and the men are just like,
But I think what Carl also showed us in a sense was that that all of those type of characters would have felt in a much more ambivalent situation, in the sense of being for empire but also for nation at the same time, without seeing any discrepancy in that, whereas it's presented as quite a stark contrast.
What's more common in the Second World War, jumping ahead, is also Aboriginal people enlisting to defend, especially once Japan enters, their country. They've been invaded once before, they don't want to be invaded again, but that's more of a Second World War discourse than a First World War discourse.
So my question actually relates to a much older form of representation and the very famous dioramas at the Australian War Memorial. And I was wondering whether they featured any Australian soldiers of colour in the tiny little battle scenes that they showed.
In the current, well, it's all being remodeled right now, and that's what I'm curious about. My understanding is, oh God, I'm trying to remember, because I had the Aboriginal tour of the War Memorial a while ago, and most of the stuff they have about Aboriginal people is Second World War related, including they have, one of the uniforms they have is Len Waters, who was the first Aboriginal member of the RAF. They have his uniform there. They have a tiny section devoted to Aboriginal people in the Second World War who served in remote areas. I vaguely recall there was one tiny piece of material culture from someone Aboriginal in the First World War, but in terms of the models and all of that, no. And that's why I'm curious to see, do they include them in the remodeling?
The remodeling.
And what their approach has been, which is quite a reasonable approach, is to integrate the stories as part of the larger story. Don't just have here's the Aboriginal story, but to get that sort of balance right between the two. And it'll be interesting to see if they do get it.
Yeah, I mean the dioramas themselves can't be changed because they're really significant historical artefacts in their own right.
Well, then maybe they'll add them to other.
They can't spray paint them. They can't re-spray paint them. Peter.
Great paper, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. I was thinking in terms of excavating silences as part of a wider project, does Indigenous anti-war sentiment
Mm.
colonialism to war, I would imagine there were groups who made that connection and thought that they would oppose the war on the basis of opposing the same type of
Mm. It's an interesting question, and the short answer is no, we haven't come across any. And part of it is that during the First World War, you don't have Indigenous organizations. The first Indigenous organizations in Australia that we know of emerged in the 1920s and the 1930s. So you don't really have that impetus. And they also didn't have the connections with the Indigenous peoples of other parts of the world either at this stage. I think, and you don't even seem to get that much with the Second World War either, to be honest. Probably because Australia is actually under threat in the Second World War. But I have been asked that before, and no one has come across any of that as of yet. Most of the men, most Aboriginal people at this stage, not all, but most, are still living in rural areas. A lot of them are employed on cattle stations. Most of them don't have access to education. Douglas Grant's an exception. So they don't have that. I mean, I'm not trying to play it down. Like, that's the case. They don't have the access to that sort of information knowledge until after the war. And a lot of these men who do become the activists after the war either served themselves or had a relative who served. And in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of the activists for Indigenous rights were Second World War veterans. So you get it after the wars.
Where was the play on?
Where was the what?
Where is the play? Is that the
It was on at the Sydney Opera House as part of the Sydney Festival in January, and they did it again in Brisbane in September. If for whatever reason it ever comes here, see it. It's fantastic.
A good note to end on. So we'll continue our discussion over a drink, which is
That makes
in
it
the next
easier.
room. And so please join me in thanking the wonderful Dr. Noah Riseman for a terrific talk.